Welcome back to Talking Blarney. Running is huge. It seems like you can't open Instagram without somebody posting their Strava stats or announcing that they've signed up for a half marathon. In 2025, nearly 2 million Americans participated in half marathons and over 400,000 participated in full marathons. It's become a cultural mainstay. But this modern popularity has its roots traced all the way back to the 1970s running boom. In today's interview, author Martin Dugard shares how distance running went from a solo loner activity to a cultural event that the growth has continued on for 5 decades long after. Enjoy. Martin Dugard, welcome.
Hey, thanks for having me, Riley. This is great.
What was your reaction when Sebastian Sawe broke the 2 hour barrier at this year's London Marathon?
It was incredulous, but it wasn't just that he broke two because I assumed that someone was going to break two, later. It's the fact that two guys broke two, and the third guy was under the old world record, and just over two. So it was coming, and I think what's going to be interesting to watch in the next, let's look at Chicago and Berlin in the fall. We're going to start seeing a lot of people go under two, and the American record is going to come way down as well. It's just the Roger Bannister effect, but yeah, that's definitely a milestone. It's definitely a landmark.
Roger Bannister was the one that broke the 4 minute mile.
First guy to break the 4 minute mile, and once it had once been considered an impossible task. The same thing as finding the source of the Nile or standing on top of Everest. But once Bannister broke four, everybody began breaking four. And right now four doesn't even qualify you for the final of the NCAA championships. Everybody's going under 350.
As somebody who witnessed the running boom in the 1970s and spent the next 5 days running yourself, how has running culture evolved over the last 5 decades?
I think we're still a little bit on the nerdy side, but running used to be for outliers. The people who really ran seriously were people who had a passion for it, but it was kind of beyond the societal fringe. And so if you were, whether you were an Olympian or whether you ran the Boston Marathon, you were a very, 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 very small segment of the population. People didn't understand running. The clothing was usually cotton or something that eventually chafed. The running shoes were what we would now consider primitive. I mean, the shoes that Shorter wore in Munich were, I don't even know how he ran in them because the sole was so thin and there's no energy return. It was just a different way to run. But now that we have so many more people doing it, we have technological advances, and one of the biggest things you think about when Shorter won Munich in '72, he refueled with bottles of defist Coca-Cola, which is, compare that to the very advanced gel and nutrition supplements that Sawe took at London. So a lot has changed, and the idea of carb loading was a brand new thing back in 1972. So we have evolved so much more.
And then when I look at the most popular running app, Strava, it has 120 monthly active users, and that's across 185 countries. It seems like now it's just not only for the weird runners running off in the woods somewhere. It's a huge multicultural conglomerate of people just kind of joining in this activity just to log miles and share their overall experience and kind of go for these tentpole events like Boston, London, Berlin, Paris. It's just overall, I feel like the growth is incredible.
Well, I think there's an underlying need for community, and I think that especially after COVID, and that's where the current running boom really was launched. Because we were alone during COVID, and running was was one of the few things we could do to get outdoors. But as soon as COVID ended, people really wanted to be together again, to go to those big races and train with those big run crews. And you asked earlier about the difference between running back in, let's say, the 1970s and running now, and it's that it back then it was a very, very small community. Now it's a worldwide community. Like you said, things like Strava. I never even wore a watch until I was, I don't know, probably 40. It just didn't seem like the watches were technologically worthy of having, and they were kind of a distraction. And now I have my Strava all the time. I'm checking my pulse. I'm checking my pace. It's just one of those things. Um, so yeah, it's nice to have that technology. It's nice to be part of the community.
People are running full marathons, half marathons, 10Ks, 5Ks nowadays. But I think as good a place to start as any is actually going all the way back into the history and what is the actual foundation? Where did the marathon race come from? What is fact and mythology about this race?
I was just listening to a really good British podcast, and they were talking about the Battle of Marathon, which is where we get the term marathon, and they call it one of the most pivotal battles in world history because it's when democracy really took root in ancient Athens. But the story there is that they won, and then they sent a messenger back to Athens to tell the people that the Athenians had beaten the Persians, on the plains of Marathon, which was right next to the ocean. And the legend is that this guy's name was Phidippides, and he ran 40K, which is just under 25 miles, up to Athens. He gets to the Acropolis. He yells Nike, Nike, which is victory, victory. We win, and then he falls over dead. That never happened. And it was kind of embellished in history, and that was a byproduct of a British poet back in the late 19th century. But that legend stands. Yeah, and it's interesting. I was talking to Grant Fisher, the Olympic medalist in the 5,000 and 10,000, and he thinks one of the reasons people are so drawn to the marathon is because it has an actual name. If you run the 5K, it's just a number, but the marathon, it stands for something. It stands for, pushing your limits. It stands for endurance. It stands for, paying the ultimate price, for your thing, which is falling over dead. So it would be nice if and because of that we have the ultra marathon, we have the half marathon. Everything revolves around the marathon. So I've always thought it'd be fun, after that conversation to, name the 5K something like, the race of truth, or just give everything a really dramatic name just to see how the dynamics would change. But I think the marathon, it still stands for many people as the ultimate test, even though, people run 350-mile races now.
How did the marathon race evolve from the 1896 Athens Olympic Games to where your book kind of centers around, which is that 1972 Munich Olympic Games?
I think it was the length, and the first one was a recreation of the exact route that was used in back at the Battle of Marathon, was allegedly used, and so in 1896 it was 40K, and then there was the Paris Olympics, and then 1904 was the St. Louis Olympics, same distance. But when they brought it to London in 1908, it was the hope that the king himself would start the race. So they moved the start back 1.2 miles into the private royal area of Windsor Castle, and that's where we get 26.2.
I did always feel like that 26.2 was just kind of an odd number to kind of land on. But as you broke down that story and kind of seeing the progress and the influence of the different individuals that actually placed the start marker where it ended up being, it is kind of funny how this history kind of creates these unique stories that are kind of hard to follow, but does capture a bit of mythology along the way.
It was fun. Like when I was writing the long run, um, I didn't know any of these things. I didn't know there was no Phidippides. I didn't know why we're at 26.2. I mean, if you ask AI will it propagates the myth that it was moved. It's 26.2 so that the royal family could watch the finish in front of the royal box. When in fact the finish was always in front of the royal box, whether it was in Athens or any place else. It was just a matter of moving the start back, which I thought was really funny. And it's interesting is subsequent Olympic marathons up until 1921 were actually longer. And I think there was one that was almost 28 miles. I can't remember which year. I think it's Stockholm, but they finally standardized it, in 1921, and so that's where we get 26.2. It has remained that way to this day.
Now, they standardize the actual length of the race. And then over the next 50-ish, 60 decades, we have these things like World War II, World War I, World War II kind of gets in the way, but the race slowly continues to pick up steam over time. And it really gets popularized in 1972's Munich Games. Can you tell us a little bit of the story about that games and why that really captured the imagination of runners around the world?
Well, I think the quick answer is television, because that was the first time that the Olympic marathon was broadcast in its entirety. And so, I mean, I remember watching it as a kid, and it was fascinating because I didn't, I knew what a marathon was because my mom was from Boston, and Bostonians talk with such reverence about the Boston Marathon, so I knew what a marathon was. But I had never seen somebody run a marathon. And I remember watching that Olympic marathon, and Shorter takes off at about the 9 mile mark, and just gets a gap and just keeps going. And so it wasn't just watching a marathon on TV, which just looked, he made it look so easy, but it was also watching an American win, which really resonated with myself and a lot of people. And again, because ABC broadcast the thing in its entirety, you really felt like you were running the marathon with Shorter, and that's where a lot of people were inspired to. They knew they couldn't run as fast as Steve Prefontaine, who also raced the 5,000 that day. It just would be impossible for everybody to run that fast. But something took hold in the imagination of Americans and people all around the world when they watched Shorter run his marathon, and we were with him the whole way. Was like, I can't run a marathon as fast as Frank Shorter, but if I run long enough, I could finish a marathon. And that's where all of a sudden we kind of began evolving from a society of people who were trying to, win races, but people who were just trying to complete a personal challenge. And that's why running is such a big bucket list item to this day. When running a marathon, if you ask most people, name your bucket list things, they're going to say something like, I want to run a marathon. And it's a wonderful thing. And it's been labeled the suburban Everest. It's something that seems impossible to a lot of people, but they're motivated to try it. And when they finish it, they find it life changing. It's a wonderful thing.
That moment with Shorter really, popularized and captured the imagination. But you kind of outlined that there was a lot of priming that went along the way. And as Americans, we always kind of like think of time in order of, presidential administrations or, those eras. And you broke down how American presidents influenced athletics and physical fitness over time. So there was this priming that went on before what would be this seminal event, which would be the 1972 Olympics, that actually got people kind of excited and conditioned a little bit to participate in athletics more. Can you break down what the president's influence over overall running and physical fitness culture was for the decades prior to the Olympic Games?
You go back to John F. Kennedy. Even before he became president, he wrote an article for Sports Illustrated talking about how Americans were growing soft, and he said this from a military point of view. It was the height of the Cold War. If we were going to go to war with the Russians, we needed to be physically fit, and so that's what Kennedy was pushing for. And he did it through the schools. He did it by pushing people through, like that article in Sports Illustrated. It became a groundswell. But so a lot of things began happening around it. The Vietnam War, came along, and everybody became a little bit more counterculture. And what could be more counterculture than, going for a run through the wilderness, which is such an individual and solitary thing. And Americans began taking to individual sports like that. I mean, if you're a high school football player and you played your last game as a senior in high school, you're probably never going to put the pads on and play football again for the rest of your life. But if you are, a runner of any age, you can keep running as long as you choose to. It's just a matter of making a commitment to it. So it's just one of those things. And but a lot of factors came in at the same time too. We had companies like Nike were born. Runner's World became, went from distance running news to Runner's World, and all of a sudden, this little niche culture of these running nerds, who, they were kind of considered crazy because there were no like running tights at that time. Men would wear pantyhose on cold days, and people would throw trash at runners or run them off the road. It was just one of those really counterculture things. And it kind of coalesced in the early 70s. And, the New York Times ran a story not that long ago saying that the running boom was caused by Shorter's victory in Munich. And I looked at the numbers, and it was part of it, but it was part of that groundswell. You had there were other marathons in America other than the Boston Marathon that began creeping up. You had the Nikes, you had the shoe companies, you had all these people began to run. So the boom really exploded in 1976. So, in conjunction with uh, the bicentennial of America, and that's when they had the first Five Boroughs Marathon in New York, and that's when people really began to come out and watch the marathon and televise the marathon and travel to marathons, and the numbers just exploded over the next 10 years.
You highlighted Nike, and over time, it was really evident that Oregon, as a state, was actually very much responsible for the popularizing of running as a cultural movement. What was it about Oregon that really kind of was the petri dish that started the running culture?
You know, a lot of people would fight you over that comment, and I've learned that after I wrote the book. Um, there was a vibrant community in Atlanta, and in Gainesville, Florida, and in Philadelphia, and in Boston. But the thing that made Eugene, Oregon, a little bit different, two things. Bill Bowerman, first of all, the head coach at the University of Oregon, who started the jogging movement in America. He brought it over from New Zealand, and Arthur Lydiard. But he was also a shoe designer. So he was the guy who used to make shoes for all of his collegiate runners, and he loved to experiment with different kinds of things. And so Bowerman was one half of the duo that formed Nike. So you had a guy who loved to make shoes. He loved to, invent with different things. He loved to push the jogging movement because he really wanted, wider national health. And then along comes this runner of his named Steve Prefontaine, who was the first real James Dean of American distance running. I mean, prior to Pre, most runners, had their hair cut short and they were pretty straight laced. Not Pre. I mean, he big raggedy mop of hair, porn star mustache. He ran from the front with just this bold, aggressive way. He loved the women, so he was not a monk like distance runners were supposed to be. He loved to drink beer, but he looked like some guy who was always looking for a fight. And so all of a sudden, running, go back to that whole nerd thing. Right, this was the first cool runner in the history of American distance running, and people latched onto that. And Nike still uses the image of Prefontaine because he is that James Dean figure for American distance running.
Yeah, a couple years back, we went to Eugene for my wife's half marathon. And Hayward Field is just kind of this incredible place. It's kind of one of those that you kind of feel the atmosphere there. And you have those legacy people like Bowerman and Phil Knight and Prefontaine standing around there. And it's this unique cultural moment that was kind of, like you said, maybe, Oregon wasn't the only place it was happening there, but it seems to be the place that really kind of solidified it and built the movement, at least in this popularizing, almost media sense, that something like a cultural movement needs to kind of coalesce around in order to evolve and capture the imagination.
That's still going on. Nike pushes what they call Hayward Magic. It's this idea that everything great in American distance running revolves around Hayward Field, and I don't necessarily completely agree, but I have been there at Hayward to experience that Hayward magic, and it is a very, very special place. And the only problem with Eugene, Oregon, is it's just so far off the beaten path. I mean, for our sport to continue growing, uh, in pop culture to be relevant, if I turn on ESPN, I can watch a cornhole tournament, which to me is preposterous, but I can't watch a track meet. So as much as I love Hayward, I feel like we need to start having some of those big meets like the Olympic trials and the World Championships in Los Angeles, in New York, in places where people can go actually see these races and build a different kind of magic. Because one of the problems we have with distance running right now is that everybody who runs a marathon runs their own personal individual race. It's such a unique experience to be a marathoner and to be a distance runner. So what we're not doing is we're not paying attention to these Olympians and these track stars. So we have this great divide of people who are great on the track and who are almost unknown, and then you have all these people who call themselves distance runners, and they are, who are doing all these marathons, but they never cross the bridge to the other side and invest all the time and energy into going to watch these great distance runners. It's just we have that cultural separation. I'd love to see that people like Grant Fisher and Cole Hawker, have them get well known as the individual marathoners.
Now, you kind of mentioned that these marathons need to happen in cultural centers. And in the United States, there's two main ones that always people highlight. They always say Boston and New York. And you know that they're doing the race in those cities. How did those races start out and how did they start becoming popularized?
So the first Boston was 1897. I ran the 100th, which was 1996, and it was the only time I've run Boston. And it's a scene. It's really cool. And I that on that particular day, I woke up with a fever of 102, and I didn't think I should run. I literally took 6 a leave, and I got on the bus and went to Hopkinton, and just told myself just to take it easy. And the drugs wore off by the time I got to Wellesley at the halfway mark. But the crowds, as you got into the city, just carried me. It was just legendary. It was just a wonderful, wonderful thing. But Boston was not Boston for until Jock Semple put qualifying times in 1970. So you only had about 100 people who ran or 200 people who ran for the first 70 plus years of the marathon's existence, and now it is what it is. And New York is the same way. The first New York was 1970. There were 127 starters and 55 finishers, and it was a hot Sunday morning. There were no porta potties. There was no official start finish line. There were no police blocking traffic. You just had to go run around Central Park 4 times, and people were out just enjoying a Sunday in the park. They didn't know what all these crazy runners were doing. Well, flash forward 6 years when they have the first Five Boroughs Marathon. Thousands of people lined the course, and they knew exactly what they were watching. But that has exploded too. Until London broke the record this year, New York held the record for the most marathoners to finish a race. Almost 60,000 people, and so and you have all the things that go with New York. It's televised. You have people coming in, staying in a hotel for a week, and eating in the restaurants. It becomes a cultural stopover. It's not just a marathon anymore. It's an event, and that's the difference between running then and running now. Is if you go to a major city marathon, I don't care if it's New York or Boston or Chicago or any place, it's an event, and everybody knows that. Like if you're wearing your runner's medal, your finisher's medal the next day to breakfast, people know you did something special. It's pretty wonderful.
Now, you mentioned Bill Bowerman, and I kind of wanted to come back to him a little bit because of his contributions. He's one of these unique individuals that kind of tinkers and builds. He makes shoes in a little room or at home. He helps found Nike. He also writes a book about jogging, which gets over 1 million copies sold and really kind of widespreads this movement for jogging in the 70s. Can you kind of talk about this individual, his personality, and what his contribution to the overall running movement was?
He's an icon. I mean, he's just one of those people. During World War II, he served in the 10th Mountain Division, which was a legendary, really hardcore, I wouldn't say Navy SEAL type group, but it was a very elite unit and trained to fight winter battles. He accepted the surrender of the German army in Italy, which is kind of cool. Yeah, then he just came back home and wanted to just go back and be a high school PE teacher, and he got selected to be the head coach at the University of Oregon, and a position which he held up until I think 1972, and uh, but along the way he was the guy who rebuilt Hayward Field the first time it was redone. He was the guy who brought the Olympic trials to Hayward Field. He was the guy who designed the first pair of spikes that Prefontaine wore, and he was like you mentioned the jogging thing. He's just one of those people that if you look at the running movement, even to this day, a lot of the things that we see and a lot of things that we do were instigated by this guy Bill Bowerman, who just not only had a passion, and he had his own ideals, but he was also very outspoken, and he was very determined to see things through and do things his way, which the sport needed at that time. The sport didn't have strong individuals like that early on, and it was kind of bullied a little bit by the Amateur Athletic Union. I don't want to go too in the weeds with it, but again, we needed an advocate for the runners, and that was Bill Bowerman.
Kind of needed a little bit of a strong man here, somebody who had some vision and some structure to kind of build the program around it. It's great to kind of hear the stories about the shoes he put together, and when we think about Nike shoes kind of getting popularized in the United States, He made the waffle iron. He literally pulled his wife's waffle iron out, made the undersole, and stuck it to a pair of shoes in order to experiment. It's just he's one of these figures that really is just interesting in history, not even sports history, but also in business history, and founding one of the greatest brands that we have in the United States.
You know, one of the things I loved about Bill Bowerman was after he made his fortune with Nike, one of the things he did later in his life was build high school tracks around the state of Oregon just to make sure that everybody had a track, which I just love that idea of making that financial commitment to a community to make sure kids have a place to go run.
Now, how did the technology of running kind of evolve over time? You mentioned this a little bit earlier that the shoes that were kind of worn in the 1970s almost look primitive to what we have today, but that was leaps and bounds of what was in front of them at the time. How did the running shoes evolve kind of to meet the demand, and how did like Nike capitalize that in the 1970s running boom?
Whew, we could really go deep in the weeds there, but you know, it was interesting. I think that one of the biggest reasons that shoes became so important. Shoes are very personal. You know, everybody has their favorite pair of shoes. The first thing you do when you make a running goal is go buy a new pair of shoes. Shoes are everything, and so every bit of technology in the running world begins and ends with shoes. And you know, back in the early '70s, the Runner's World had the first ever kind of a shoe buyer's guide, like these are the best shoes, and they kind of anointed the best shoes, and so then people argued about it and people fought about it, but it led to an evolution in shoes, and one of the reasons that Nike took off was that they had, because of their corporate structure, they had the ability to adapt very quickly, and they had about a 5 year window where, through that quick adaptation, they kind of began monopolizing. They went from an off-brand. I remember wearing a Nike shirt. It said Nike on it with a swoosh, and people would say, "What is Nike?" And that's, you know, and it's almost unheard of to think like that now. But for a while there, Nike was just kind of the cool runner brand, and it overtook Adidas, which was kind of the old school running shoe. You know, been going back to World War II, and so, but then everything kind of evolves around that. All of a sudden, we began looking at different fabrics for the clothing we wore, so it didn't chafe and it could wick away moisture. We started looking at running watches, and I remember Timex had the Timex Triathlon watch, which again, by modern standards, it's just a little cheap little watch, but back then it was the height of technology. We started learning how to eat better. I mean, I remember finishing cross country practice one day thinking I was going to refuel, and of course there was no Gatorade in the stores. Gatorade was just such a new novelty thing. So I went to Winchell's and bought 6 glazed donuts and just ate those. And that was my idea of getting better. So it was just, we learned. We learned about what we could put into our bodies. We learned about what shoes worked well for us. The shoe companies really worked on the technology, whether it was the design of the shoe or the constitution of the midsole or the outsole with you know, with the waffle or other different designs. You know, shoes went from being heavy leather to nylon to different mesh fabrics, all these things, and they continue to evolve. One of those things. If you really want to have a good time, sit down with a bunch of shoe designers and listen to them talk shoes, because they know the shoe inside and out, and just, you know, talk about the size of the toe box, and you know, whether, you know, is it zero drop, or you know, all, you know, the constitution of the midsole, is it EVA or is it a different kind of foam. it's it's fun, but it just highlights how far we've come from the time where a running shoe was just a little rubber sole with an upper, and it weighed about 6 ounces. And which, by the way, Sebastian Sawe's shoe are much lighter than that right now and much thicker. So anyway, it technology has definitely adapted. So, you know, that's one of the things about the long run, that you know, it's been marketed as a history book, but really it's more just a love story about running, and it talks about all these changes and these adaptations that I've been able to witness over the years, and it's just a different take on running. It's for anyone who's new to the sport, it's a great way to kind of, you know, get the lay of the land and know where you fit in, whether you started running last month or last year.
As you say, this is kind of a love story. We fall in love with these stories of athletes that are at the forefront or they achieve something very unique. What did you learn about the mentality and psychology of runners when you interviewed Frank Shorter, the gold medalist at the Munich Games?
I don't know that I learned that much. You know, I I've been running a long time myself. As a journalist, I covered the sport um, back in the late '80s and early '90s. I've been a high school coach for 20 years, and if you do it long enough, you get accustomed to that runner's mentality. And so,
Mhm.
I think when I talked to Shorter, when I talked to Rogers, what I heard coming from them was their passion not just for running but for racing. In the matter of fact way they talked about their races, and these are some of the most accomplished distance runners in the history of the sport. And you mere mortals can't just can't do what they do, but they talk about it so casually about really pushing their limits and really really hurting. And so I think if there's anything I learned about runners is that, as I said before, it's such an individual thing, but everybody who calls himself a runner, you're not just you don't have you're not you're passionate about it. You care about it. It's not one of those things where you can say, I can take it or leave it. It's one of those things like, no, I'm a runner. I love running. I love all these things. In runners think about running. Runners wake up and they love to talk about running. They love to talk about their shoes. And there's just this underlying passion to the sport that you don't find for a lot of other things. I'm sure tennis players love tennis, for instance, or golfers, are passionate about golf, but it's not the same as runners because it's such an immersive physical experience when you go out for a run. It's not something that you can do halfway. It's just you're all in. You're committed, emotionally, uh, physically, and financially.
Yeah, when you say that you're all in, it's 2+ hours of consistent progression and fatigue and buildup. You're accounting for elevation, you're accounting for the kick of your competitor. Where are you positioned on the track? What do you have to leave in the tank in order to have a nice kick at the end? It is got to be one of the. I've never ran a full marathon myself, but I can imagine as you're doing it competitively, that last 5 miles or so has got to be something psychologically impactful.
Uh, I'll tell you, I've run a bunch. I've run a bunch of marathons, and I've never run the last 5 miles properly. I'm just so far uh, in in the pain cave. I mean, I was thinking about as you were talking. I was thinking about New York. You just at the 24-mile mark, you come back into Central Park off of Fifth Avenue, and there's a long downhill there. And after all these miles of running, either flat or a little bit uphill, a downhill just crushes your quads. And every year in New York when I run it, that downhill I cramp up, and and it's like I'm never doing this again. I hate this. I am suffering so much. And then I find a way to start running again. Then I go around the corner in Central Park South, and you've got this wall of spectators, and they're cheering, and you realize the finish isn't that far away, and you kind of will yourself to get there, and then it's no sooner do you get done, you go, I think I could do this again. It's just I don't know. It's a different math for the last 4 to 5 miles of a marathon. It's wonderful and it's torturous at the same time.
One of the other individuals that you highlight in this book is Steve Prefontaine. Was he the star that running really needed at that time?
I don't think running needed it. We already had Jim Ryan, and Jim Ryan was, if you were a 10-year-old kid, 11-year-old kid, and you showed any inclination towards distance running in the early '70s, people would say stuff like, "Oh, you want to be the next Jim Ryan?" So he was the man. But uh, Pre was just different, though. The thing about Pre was he didn't. Jim Ryan was great, and he was a miler. He made the mile his own. He went to the Olympics at 17 years old, 1964. But Pre was this guy who didn't want to just run the race. He wanted to make the race a work of art. He saw it as something creative. And like you were talking earlier about, if you're on the track, you need to know, where to position yourself, when to kick, do all those things. And he saw that as no different than a painter making a painting or a poet writing a poem. He saw running as a thing of beauty, and um, and I think that was a different attitude than anybody had ever had before. And he talked about it openly. And here's a kid. He's from a logging town. You think he's gonna be a little bit of a roughneck, and it turns out to be he's this for him to make this a creative activity. I just think that's beautiful. And I think that's what the sport needed.
The sad thing about Prefontaine is that he had such amazing potential. He had flair. He had amazing ability. And it's a story of somebody taken away too soon in that car crash. What could have Steve Prefontaine accomplished if that car crash never had occurred?
Okay, so at the time, he held every American record from 2,000 meters to 10,000 meters. I think he would have run the 5K again in Montreal. I think he would have tried to beat Lassie Varon. And Varon won gold in the 5 and 10 again in Montreal as he had in Munich. I think Pre would have moved up to the marathon for 1980 and been really pissed that we boycotted. And then I think he would have run the marathon again in 1984 in Los Angeles. And he would have only been 33. So, and the guy who won in Los Angeles that year, Carlos Lopes from Portugal, was 37. So, using that math, I think Prefontaine probably could have competed at the marathon level up to about 1988. And I think that's what he would have done. I think he would have stayed away from the mile after a while. He ran a 3:54 mile, so he was definitely not a slouch, but that wasn't his race. I think that he liked races where he could show how much guts he had, and I think the marathon would have really suited him. And he was no stranger to long hard runs, so I think that the idea of him moving to the marathon would have been very very easy for him. The question is, let's say he retires at 38. What does Steve Prefontaine do for the rest of his life? I have no idea. He's just he's like George Patton. George Patton was not a man who was suited for peacetime, and so he died shortly after the end of World War II. It was a horrible thing and he died tragically, just like Pre. But both of those people seemed like they had their moment in these stars that just burned too bright and burned out early.
Now, one of the other things that you highlight in the book is that the marathon progressed over 70, 80 years leading up to uh, Munich and Quebec, Montreal. But one of the things that was highlighted is that women were not participating in that race, or they were really fighting to get involved in running, especially at distance. Why did women get forced out of that race for so long? And what did it take for them to finally establish themselves and become participants?
Well, there are so many. There was this mistaken belief that if women ran long distances, their internal organs would fall out of their body and, literally splat on the pavement as they ran, which seems so idiotic. So the longest distance for women was 800 meters until 1972. Then it became, 1,500 meters, which is still very short. And so, as they wrote the long run, some reviewers have said, oh, you give all this emphasis to the men, and then the women come in later in the book. Well, that's just chronology. That's exactly how it was. Women's participation was so minimal up until the late 1970s. I mean, women ran Boston, starting in 1966. But it wasn't like they were a big part of the fabric, and the times weren't that good. But then in 1978, Greta Weitz ran the New York City Marathon. She was a Norwegian who was about to retire from running. She had raced the 15 at uh, at Munich and then again at Montreal. And she just wanted a trip to New York with her husband, and so she reached out to the New York Roadrunners Club, which sponsors New York, and she asked if they might provide her with a plane ticket and an entry. She just wanted to go to New York, and she was a school teacher, and she was going to go back to teaching school the day after the race. Um, and the fact that she not only ran it, but she destroyed almost every guy on the course. It was the first time that people had seen a woman really run at such an elite level for a marathon. And then she came back again and did it even faster the next year. And that caused the New York Times to write an opinion piece, an op-ed piece, saying women should run the marathon at the Olympics. We need a women's Olympic marathon. And so that's exactly what happened. And that was 1984 was the first one. So as you follow the book, we get to New York in 1976, and we talk about the running boom and some of the stuff that happens in 1977. But the women's thing really starts in 1978. And then when Joan Benoit wins the first women's marathon and Olympic marathon in 1984 in Los Angeles, it's a great moment. She is an adorable woman. She looks too small to endure such a a tough race, and she does it. But the interesting thing is the women's running boom. That term "boom" I feel like is overused. It's almost like revolution is a better word. The women's running scene doesn't really pick up actually until Oprah Winfrey runs the Marine Corps Marathon in the early 1990s. And what's significant about that was that that was the first time that I think that people said, I can do the marathon too. People who weren't skinny, white, 35 years old, that was the median age. All of a sudden, you had somebody who doesn't look like a traditional marathoner outrunning a marathon, and suddenly the marathon took off for women. And now you have it's almost 50-50 between men and women when you go to marathons. And I do remember one time at New York, in those final miles, as I was struggling, watching like a group of like five women. They still had their sweatshirts tied around their waist, just blow past me at like the 22-mile mark, and it's just so humbling. But it shows you how far women's running can get. They're not just out there running. They've got a sweatshirt. It's almost like they're being casually fast just by the way they're dressed and the way that they finish the race with such panache.
Think that brings us to the 1970s, the boom or the revolution, as you maybe like to rebrand it. What was it like living in that time frame? What was happening around all these turns? What was really the cultural moment that was the running boom?
I'm, I'm convinced the boom started at the 3 mile mark of the 1976 New York City Marathon, just as they came off the bridge, and for the first time ever, they were met by this wall of noise, just all these spectators, because spectators are a new thing at the marathon. Again, because they weren't doing 4 laps around Central Park, they were running through the entire city. So people, came out of their houses, they brought their kids with them, they had a cup of coffee and they handed out oranges, and they just and literally just cheered on the runners, and that cheering continued throughout the length of the course, and that was when it really took off, and it became a cool thing to do. Everyone wanted to go back and do New York again, and it would just and again, New York was soon televised, and it just became, and more foreigners began flying over to test it, because, again, New York City, on marathon day, it's late fall, the leaves are golden, you finish in Central Park, it's you start in Staten Island, go over the bridge, and it's just lovely, and that all of that came together at a time when we were just coming off of the Watergate hearings, and the president stepping down. We had the Vietnam War was finally over. It was kind of like we wanted to do something. We wanted to get out there, and we want to do something unique and different. And then Jim Fixx wrote the complete book of running, which sold millions of copies. And next thing you know, the sport just took off. And as somebody who had been there when it was just a really small niche sport, it was a little bit. I was taken aback, because all of a sudden, instead of having my own little cool sport, everybody was doing my own little cool sport, and I wasn't sure if I liked having all these people out there on the roads with me. And in the end, I made my terms with it. But a lot of people chose not to stick with running. That's when the Hawaiian Ironman was founded. That's when Western States Ultra was founded. That's when mountain biking became a thing. So all of these things grew out of just the idea that we should all be out there getting physically fit, and we just found it didn't necessarily have to be running anymore. We could all do different things.
Would it be safe to say that it became something beyond a form of entertainment? As sports like football, baseball, basketball were getting popularized in the 70s and 80s, that was a very stationary, you're watching, you don't get to play in the NFL past, 34. But running became something that not only could you watch, but you could also participate in. And even though you're not to the level of the professional runners, you're still able to participate more than, throwing on the pads and, hitting into the line as a linebacker.
That's a really good point. When we talk about that time, it shouldn't be seen as solely a running revolution or running boom, whatever you want to call it, but it's the birth of this mass participation, this birth of people just regular people just decide that they want to run around the block, and so they go buy a pair of shoes, and then they decide they want to do a 10K, then half marathon, then a marathon. But it's that mass participation thing, and it goes back to what we said earlier about community. Once you develop that running community, I mean, one of the reasons people do big races like London and New York. I mean, London has 60,000 people this year. Set the new record. Is due to go probably to two days next year. So it'll be a men's day and a women's day next year. I mean, that's how big it is. But it's that sense of community. So for a while there during COVID, they were letting people do the marathon. You could put it on your Strava. You could do 26.2 on Strava, and they would basically say, "Thank you. Here's your finisher medal. You prove that you did it." But if you do it solo like that, it's not the same. So you want to be out there with the people. You want that experience. You want the music before the start. You want the national anthem. You want women running in tutus and men, running some, just all sorts of different things, all the different personalities you see at these races. And even the spectators take part, spectators holding up signs, waiting for a loved one. It's just, it is just this great mass participation thing. And all of that grew out of just some events back in the 1970s that made running cool. It's transformational.
Now, when something kind of captures the cool imagination or cultural imagination, there's a proliferation of media. What were like, were there magazines? Were there news articles? Was there music, movies? What were the things that were helping popularize it beyond just the participation in the local community?
Well, it was everywhere, and I remember, I think it was Lee Majors, who was the Bionic Man, was on the cover of People magazine, running, and so it was just one of those things where all of a sudden everybody was running, and shoes like the Nike Cortez, which it's a really attractive shoe, but it's not a great running shoe, became just these cultural icons, and people started changing the fact people would start wearing their running shoes as their casual footwear. It just is one of those things that uh, all the all the stuff that came with being a runner just wasn't confined to running anymore. It became part of our culture. We wore like you'd wear your Boston Finishers sweatshirt or something like that. It was just one of those things where, and that continues to this day. In read somewhere that in Paris, it is now okay to wear your workout clothes to breakfast afterwards, because before it was kind of considered just a fashion, no. And now so many people are running that it's considered okay to go to the cafe wearing your running stuff. And so that's how all this has really invaded popular culture. Even people who don't run, I think, aspire just a little bit to want to run. That's why they've adopted some of the clothing and some of the footwear that runners wear, because I think at some point eventually everyone's going to try a 5K. Everyone's going to try to do, you know, become a runner just to see if they can do it, and that's a pretty cool thing.
I think that brings us kind of to the modern day here is that did the boom really kind of ever end or did it just evolve over time? Because when I'm kind of analyzing things, I almost see like a running revolution 2.0 or a fitness revolution 2.0 where I can't open Instagram or social media without seeing somebody posting their Strava stats or talking about how they joined this event. Maybe it's a CrossFit, High Rocks, marathon, full marathon. There just seems to be these events that are happening, and people are, I mean, even in the terms of like clothing, you talked about it fashion wise, athleisure is like a huge segment of fashion category now. Um, the lines between just everyday and actual athletic participation seems to be blurring a bit.
Oh, definitely. But that earlier part of your question about if we're in a 2.0, actually I think we're in 3.0 as far as the running thing, and it's we had the original boom, and then things took off, then they plateaued for a while, then they took off again. That's where we are right now. Running is bigger now than it's ever been, and it's really, really, really cool to watch. And it's one of those things where I don't think it's you can't go back. You can't put the genie back in the bottle. People love to run. They love to do these events, and I think the only limit for the popularity of the sport is finding ways like London is doing to make their marathons more accessible. You can't put a million people on the streets of New York at the same time running a marathon. It would just be impossible. But I but people will find a way, and I this boom is going to keep getting bigger. Shoe sales are going to keep getting shoes still. I can't remember the numbers, but shoe sales are expected to almost triple in the next 5 years. So that's a big deal, and I think that it just speaks to the power of the sport and the allure of the sport.
In research, I was looking up how many individuals participate in full marathons and how many people participate in half marathons. And I think it said in 2025, nearly 2 million Americans participated in some sort of half marathon. And it's getting very close to 500,000 of people doing full marathons.
Yeah, I think. Well, I'm guilty of that too. I was kind of inspired. I'm not sure if I was inspired by the shoes or the time, but I kind of gave up my marathon career a few years ago just because marathons are hard. you know, and I get my competitive urges satisfied through coaching, and I'm just one of those guys who likes to go out and find a trail and just be alone and think my thoughts and enjoy a good run. But recently, I put my name into the lottery for the 2027 London Marathon just because it'd be kind of fun to get back out there and do one more. Uh, you know, there's something to be said for the training. There's something to be said for the discipline of having a goal and trying to reach that goal. And, in those, that I call it waking up nervous, that race day feeling when you get out of bed and you just know, I got to go do something hard today. And it's not something that everybody appreciates, but once you've gone through it, it's one of those things that you like to duplicate it again and again.
Somebody with a business background, whenever I go into one of these race expos or anything, the economy around running or athletics is astounding. I can't think of how many different kinds of goos or energy chews they have, recovery socks, different. I mean, the footwear is always a mainstay, athletic wear, finisher gear. The economy around running is probably bigger than ever and seems to continue to grow. If you brought somebody from like that 1970s era and you plopped them down into one of these modern expos, would they be astounded at the growth of this sport?
Yeah, I can't imagine they wouldn't be. It's just it again because it was such a small culture back then. It was it was a handful of people. If you knew five people who were runners, it was probably because you were on the cross country team at your local high school. But and if you talked about running, people looked at you like, so what, you just run? People couldn't get it. So again, to go to the economy of these things, I mean, the running tourism is a vibrant part of most cities' actual budget. You think about all the tax dollars brought into a city by heads in beds, restaurants, Broadway shows, all the people going to the expo and buying all sorts of different things. I mean, it's an actual part of people's budget when they go to a marathon is to go buy merch. So it's a huge thing. And yeah, I think anybody would be foolish or would be odd not to be amazed by how far running has come.
Now, that 2 hour barrier was obviously broken at the London Marathon. What do you think is the next milestone? What is the next thing that people are going to be on the edge of their seat, kind of anticipating watching when this next barrier gets broken?
I, I, I don't know. Let's go back to Bannister. When Bannister broke 4 minutes in the mile, um, it was a big deal. But when people broke 3:55 and 3:50 and 3:45, it, people didn't. I don't think they cared. They were amazed, but it was not the same as that hard 4 minute thing. And I think it's the same with the 2 hour thing. I think if a woman went under two, which is who knows, may happen in my lifetime, but that would be the next big thing. But I do think that starting this year, we're going to see people go under 159, then under 158, under 157, and I think if you want to look for something, I think when an American finally breaks 2 hours, that's going to be a big deal. To which all the Africans will say, what took you so long? So it's, I don't think they're, I think the real barrier numbers are going to be is race size instead of race speed, because most people are dazzled by the sub 2 hour marathon, but I think the biggest limitation on the sport right now is finding ways to get more people on the streets for these big races.
Now, if you're one of those people looking to sign up for their first race, what advice or what could they learn from your book here about what it takes or the participation in this grander sport that they are going to be involved in?
Well, I think the book is it's kind of it'll help people navigate the running world because because I don't just talk about the races and the people. There are a couple little areas in there that I talk about some aspects of the running world that are just a little bit offbeat. Like for instance, I mean, if you're a runner, you at some point learn where all the water fountains and public restrooms in big bushes are in your town. If you're a runner, sooner or later you have gone to a race and you've had a horrible race and then you sign up for next year anyway. Just all these, it's almost like a reassurance that these emotions you're having are very common among the runners. There's just a commonality to all the little quirky things that we do, and whether you run with, one of those vests that has all the rehydration stuff, and you run with a water bottle, or if you just get out there as minimalist as possible. Running is a big tent. Everybody's welcome inside the tent, and I think that that's what the book puts forth.
Martin, appreciate your book. Appreciate everything you've done. Please share with the audience where they can find you, where they can purchase your book, and what else you've got going on.
Good. Thanks for asking. The long run is available everywhere. It's Barnes Noble, bookstores everywhere. It's online. Amazon, Indie Books. You can find me, author Martin Dugard, on Instagram. You can also find me on I think X. I still want to call it Twitter, and just Martin J Dugard. And then also my website. I do a weekly blog, and it's just martindugard.com. And the blog is usually about something running related, and or some insight or some competitive thing that I've pulled from that week's training with my athletes. So a lot of fun stuff there. But go buy your copy of The Long Run. It's a great book. It's a lot of fun.
Martin, thank you so much. Appreciate you.
All right, man. Hey, that was great. Have a great day.